Yeah, right.
There's been this
I do prefer absolutely.
When did you get in? Hey, when were you in?
Thursday night.
She's been living tough already.
Yeah. He said I'm almost all local.
Must be exhausted.
Okay. Please take it.
Okay.
Right.
we sit down?
Yes, do. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adrian Butcher. I'm the Director for Communications for the Anglican Communion. Welcome to the Anglican Consultative Council 17, ACC 17, 17th meeting of the Council here at the Gold Coast Hotel in Hong Kong. As you can see, our panel for this afternoon's press conference, I'll introduce them, although they do rather speak for themselves, but I'll just introduce them anyway. So we have Archbishop Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. Beside him is Archbishop Josiah Adu-Firon, who is Secretary General of the Anglican Communion. And this way is Archbishop Paul Kwong, who is the Primate of Hong Kong, our host here, and also the Chair of ACC. And beside me here is Canon Margaret Swinson, who is the Vice Chair of ACC. Can I just start with a couple of house rules before we get going? When we come to the questions and answers, please can I ask you to say your name and the organisation that you represent, and say it quite clearly. We are live streaming this afternoon, so we want to make sure it's picked up on the internet as well.
Once he's finished.
Please can you make sure your phones are switched to silent? Classic. Thank you.
I was.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask each of the panel in turn just to begin with a short statement about their hopes and expectations of ACC 17. But if you don't mind, I want to start by just saying a short prayer. Heavenly Father, we give thanks for this day and this opportunity to gather together in this beautiful part of the world. We ask you, we invite you to be present by your Holy Spirit during our time here. We give thanks to you for the media and all the good work that they do around the world to bring truth to light. And we remember those who do so at considerable risk to themselves. We ask you to bless our time this afternoon and throughout ACC 17. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Archbishop Justin, would you like to go first with your hopes for ACC 17?
Thank you very much, Aidan. And thank you very much to all of you for being here today. It's very much appreciated. There seems to be quite a crowd. I think, judging by the size of the room, slightly more than we expected. So we're very grateful. My hopes for this ACC are for a continuation of the process of the Anglican Communion looking outwards. We bring together people from probably 37 of our 40 provinces, from areas as different as Papua New Guinea to Toronto or New York, areas like that, and everything in between. We bring together people who come from churches which are on Wall Street and are full of investment bankers, through to people who have churches in northern Uganda full of refugees, and people who have suffered terribly in war and persecution, through to people who live in great comfort, and all of them seeking to be disciples of Jesus Christ. And that is a huge challenge. Diversity does not make life more comfortable, but it does reflect the reality of God's gift of the church. So my hope is that in our diversity we learn to love each other more deeply and to love the world we are called to serve more effectively in transforming societies, in serving the poor and the weak, in caring for those caught up in terrible circumstances, and in looking after one another.
Could I invite Archbishop Paul to go into bat second, as it were, and I think you're going to speak in Cantonese first and then in English.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to speak few words in Cantonese, and then I'll repeat it in English if I may. 首先呢係好歡迎你哋呢係今日下晝出席呢一個嘅記者招待會，係嚟到呢係了解一下我哋 ACC 17喺香港舉行呢一個嘅會議，究竟呢係想做啲乜嘢？咁我對呢個 ACC 17嘅期望呢，就係好想呢係聽下嚟自我哋普世聖公宗咁多嘅教省嚟自160幾個國家，究竟呢天父喺佢哋嗰啲地方所作嘅奇功究竟神喺嗰度做咗啲乜嘢？佢哋聽下佢哋嘅 stories， 佢哋講上帝嘅作為。另外都想聽下佢哋呢係點樣回應喺佢哋嘅生命裏邊，喺佢哋嘅個教會裏邊點樣回應呢上帝呢一個嘅恩典，上帝呢一個嘅工作。另一方面呢，最主要我好希望呢一個嘅17呢就能夠呢係加強我哋呢一個普世聖公宗嘅關係，亦都希望呢我哋呢個普世聖公宗嘅存在，呢個教會嘅存在呢係為咗上帝嘅聖工嘅。咁你能夠呢，好似我喺一個地方都講呢，能夠發出呢個基督嘅香氣，令到呢世界其他嘅人呢都能夠呢係聞到基督嘅香氣，能夠呢喺佢嘅生命裏邊呢係能夠就發出咗呢一個上帝嘅愛帶俾其他嘅人。And first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you to this press conference for ACC 17. My dream or my hope for ACC 17 is twofold. One is bringing people from different parts of the communion together, is to hear from them the stories of what God has been doing in their lives, in their churches, in our communion, and also how they respond to God's calling, to respond to God's grace, and respond to God's call in the mission. And secondly, I really want to see ACC can contribute to helping to bring our communion more closer together for mission, and also make our communion more relevant to the world in which God has called us to serve. So basically, I really want to see this ACC will gives out the fragrance of Christ to the world.
Thank you, Archbishop. Secretary General, would you like to give us an idea of some of your hopes for the ACC?
ACC, as the Archbishop has already mentioned, is one of the 4 instruments. And this is the only instrument that brings together the threefold orders: the lay, the clergy, and the bishops. And so it is actually very representative of the communion itself. I speak as the secretary. I hear those who do not really understand the nature of ACC call us all sorts of names. Or it's full of liberals, or it's full of raving evangelicals, or no church at all, which is good, because we now have liberals, if you like. I have to use this vocabulary because that is what I hear out there. You have liberals, you have evangelicals, you have middle of the road, and everybody will bring his or her own church conviction, evangelical conviction, we use these gifts God has given to the communion to grow the church, because our theme is intentional discipleship. You don't expect me to evangelize the way you do or to do discipleship the way you do it. So ACC will bring all this together and will be able to now inform the other two instruments. I mean, the Lambeth Conference bishops meet once in 10 or 12 years. Primates, they meet, well, thank God that the new Archbishop wants his colleagues all the time, so they meet twice a year. But it means that ACC can now influence and inform these other two instruments. Of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the president. So I'm looking forward to these various gifts, these various ways of discipling people brought together and then plowed into these other instruments. That's my expectation.
Thank you. Tanner Margaret, to conclude.
Thank you. It's always difficult in these contexts going last. Because that's okay. It's okay. And I would agree with very much of what's being said. But I think also for me one of the key things is the time we spend in small groups, talking with and getting to know people from bits of the communion very unlike our own bits of the communion. And it helps, I hope it will help, that each of us to go away with a greater sense of an understanding of what's happening in the world. I mean, not just in the church, but also in the world. And I'll perhaps give an example from the Lambeth, the meeting in Lusaka, where I was on a table with one of the bishops from Japan, and he was talking to us about the ongoing issues they were having following all the tsunami and the nuclear effects of that, and how that that's faded from everybody's consciousness, but it was brought to us very sharply in those conversations. And so it helps me to make sense of the world and the church in the world and how the church can serve the world. And I hope it will do that for others.
Thank you. Right, I can open the floor now. So, as I said, please give your name and the organisation for which you work, and who would like to go first?
Paul Handley from the Church Times. It's quite a tall order when you've got two individuals, or possibly three, from a whole province to come halfway across the world, or just around the corner, to meet a lot of people. I'm not really asking about what happens this week. What's happening? It's your point, really, Josiah, about the reporting back. How does this group of people influence both the other instruments and the church at large?
Thank you. Before now, we used to have one representative from some provinces, but the new order is at least two, which means they can compare notes. It also means where we used to have either a priest or a bishop, we now have a priest and a layperson. Where we used to have might be a female or a male, we now have a male and a female. So we expect them to compare notes and report back to their provinces. And I know that there are provinces that actually function the Anglican way, where there will be debate, decisions will be taken, and then passed down to the diocese. So for me, one of the ways of making sure our decisions, our suggestions get down to the grassroots level is to encourage members of the ACC to work hard and see that their provinces own, that's the word I'm looking for, to own the decisions arrived at during this ACC. Let them own it and then contextualize it to their situation.
Perhaps I might add to that as somebody who is part of a delegation as opposed to here by virtue of a particular role I occupy. And we do report to the General Synod. We use our experiences at the ACC to put into debates in our General Synod. So when we've had debates around the environment, for example, the experiences that we've had in other parts of the communion can help to inform that debate and to help our particular churches to think more widely about what they're doing and the consequences of that for other people in other parts of the communion. So those opportunities exist, and we then take those into our own diocese quite naturally because they form part of what we are in our Christian lives and our Christian ministry, and the way we do our other parts, speaking as a layperson, the way I do the other parts of my life, which are my paid work, which is outside the church in its structural context.
Could I ask a follow-up to that? Just very quickly. How does that? We were talking about the intentional discipleship, which was a key issue at 2016, and yet it's not a phrase either of us recognised from our own provinces, and this is 3 years on. Is this? I'm not. Well, let's. How do you think that's been moved on? I mean, you come back to the subject this time round. How has that been communicated to the provinces?
I think one of the things we see in the Anglican Communion, given that we don't have a pope, we are not a sort of top-down, hierarchical, controlled body in that way, in which, a synod issues a statement and that makes things happen, or at least is meant to. It's very much that what happens with the instruments of communion percolates through rather than goes down like a command. So I was very struck at a recent meeting of bishops and archbishops of the Church of England how many diocesan bishops were casually referring to the 5 marks of mission, which they wouldn't have done 7 or 8 years ago. I didn't hear so much 7 or 8 years ago when I was first a bishop. And it just seems it's slowly worked its way into the system. And they're now thinking about the mission of their own diocese in terms of the 5 marks of mission. Similarly, intentional discipleship, I began to hear the phrase being used. We don't have a global synodical system. That has always been entirely contrary to the Anglican way of doing things. Provinces are autonomous but interdependent, as you know, to use that phrase. And therefore, we are, however, seeing, funnily enough, I was reading it earlier today, provinces around the world, West Indies has just been doing it and others have, who are beginning to pick up on this material and are getting very excited about it. So it's a process of cultural change rather than a sudden directive from on high. I don't know, Archbishop Paul, you may agree or disagree.
Well, I totally agree with what you are saying, Your Grace.
You don't have it on. Why break the habit of a lifetime?
In this area, because
Next question: in what area do you disagree?
Not everything. But anyway, yes, the different provinces are doing the intentional discipleship in the in their own indigenous way. But here in Hong Kong, this week, the delegates will have a chance, to visit some of our places where they can experience the intentional discipleship in action, in practice. Here in this church, in this province, a couple of years ago in our last General Synod, we passed a resolution on policy, on church policy, which is basically a discipleship paper, and ever since that we have set up a committee to implement that policy. Now across the whole province. Each parish is doing it. So here in Hong Kong, we are doing it through education, and through social services, through evangelism, and through theological education.
I think also with things like intentional discipleship, the concepts and thinking behind it may infiltrate programs in the church without necessarily the title being attached. The renewal and reform work in the Church of England is influenced by the whole idea of intentional discipleship, but it's not labelled as that. So I think we need to get onto the things that are underneath, not necessarily look just at the particular label.
KC Wong of the Hong Kong Catholic newspaper. Yeah, welcome to here. Yeah.
Thank you very
from
much.
From the ACNS, I learned that, if I'm correct, that some participants are being nominated by the ACC, and they are the youth representatives. Can you please tell something more on this? Because the Catholic Church right now, we are also having a synod on youth.
So we have, the ACC has had the custom of having young people from the area in which it meets involved at ACC, but we've taken a decision to expand that. So as full members of the ACC, there will be young people representing the 5 regions. So we have 5 regions, the province is grouped into 5 regions, and each region is invited to send 2 young people as full voting members of the ACC, and that's new this time.
How do we define young?
Under 35, 18 to 35.
For us, it's just more reasonable. It's really young, because for WY is another. So
and they will serve, providing they remain within that age bracket. They will come to 2 ACC meetings.
So before that, young representatives are just observer. They have no full rights.
But they now have the full vote.
And so altogether now there's 5 or 10 joined to this meeting.
It's up to 10.
But up to 10.
Up to 10. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that does not stop provinces from sending young people as part of their delegations at the provincial level.
For ACNS, Gavin Drake, the Safe Church Commission is due to release its report during this ACC. How important is safeguarding for the community?
Well, that's a point that is very, very close to my own heart. There are a number of provinces of the Communion that have had to acknowledge their failures in safeguarding over the years. The Church of England, of course, most notably last year when a number of us, including myself, gave evidence to the independent inquiry on child sexual abuse. Also Australia, Canada have had to deal with really bad things. I think New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken, have had some incidents. And I think one of the points of being a communion is you learn not only from each other's successes, but from each other's failures and shames. And the Safe Churches Commission is at the absolute heart of mission. Because if you're not going to be, or intentional discipleship, you cannot have a church that ill-treats children and vulnerable adults. And therefore that report is crucial. Much more crucial is the very complicated process of implementing that on the ground. It's one thing in England. If you're in a province where, a friend of mine in former bishop in South Sudan, 95% of the people of his diocese are now refugees. When you've got people hunted and harried, or in the DRC or other places, how do you put in place a safeguarding system? You know, you're not going to do DBS checks. And I think, therefore, this is the beginning of a journey for the communion of each place, culturally, appropriately, in its own indigenous way, ensuring that the church is not only safe for its members, but can be seen as a place of safety for all those who are suffering from abuse.
And I think it's also important to say that the ACC has been working on this now for some years,
Absolutely.
and looking to provide physical, emotional, and spiritual places of safety for people, but also to help each of the provinces understand and grasp how people might not feel safe, because what feels safe in one place may not feel safe in another, and vice versa. So I think it's an example of where working together actually is really important, because it gives those different nuances and understandings, and the opportunity to create good practice and so on across our churches.
If I may, Your Grace, as an African, I hear safeguarding. Will you be kind enough to sort of bring it down to my level of understanding? What exactly is this? Because there are many out there probably watching or listening. Safeguarding, what is this?
Thank you. It's a very good correction. Safeguarding is about ensuring that everyone in the church is free from abuse that is sexual, emotional, spiritual, mental, physical. It could range from domestic abuse, from the beating of a partner, sexual abuse, obviously. It can affect children or adults that are vulnerable, and they may be vulnerable not because they're particularly weak, but because they are in a position of they're being ill-treated by someone who has a position of power over them. So, for instance, someone goes to see a bishop or a priest, and there is inappropriate behaviour. It's not only sexual. It can also just be bullying, harassment, ill treatment, demeaning treatment. But it's not general in the sense that not all ill treatment is safeguarding. It is ill treatment when there is vulnerability because of being a child or a vulnerable adult.
Thank you.
I think, I'm just looking at Paul Feely from Canada over there. Is that a fair description, Paul?
Absolutely.
Mary Frances Schonberg from Episcopal News Service in the U.S. I see on the agenda on next Saturday Lambeth 2020 is up for discussion. I'm sure that will be a report about the status of planning and so forth. But I'm also wondering if there are any plans to discuss some of the controversy that's come up over the decision about same-gender spouses.
The answer to that is no. Although there will be an opportunity outside the conference for members of the conference to ask me questions. The reason for that is, as Archbishop Josiah alluded to in his opening remarks, the Lambeth Conference, the ACC, is the only one of the four instruments that is under a legal jurisdiction. It is an English company with charitable aims, and as such is governed by its trust deeds under English law. The trust deeds very clearly specify what it can and can't do, and also, doctrine is not one of the issues that it does, and that's very clear in the trust deed. Secondly, the decision as to who to invite or not to invite to the Lambeth Conference has since 1867 been always the decision of the Archbishop of Canterbury and falls within that office. I've decided that it would be useful to give people an opportunity to ask me any questions they like about any subject they like. I have no doubt that will be one of those that is asked. And that will be in a private session so that people can express themselves freely and clearly and express their disagreement, which is perfectly proper. And it is worth noting that the controversy is not only one way. There is also a great deal of controversy, in which I've received a significant number of letters as well, about the fact that I have invited bishops in same-sex partnerships, quite a significant number, when none were invited in 2008. That's a point that's sometimes forgotten.
Just now, the question about a same-sex union is raised up. I remember in 2002, when the ACC held in Hong Kong. At that time, in the ecumenical church awareness, these issues were hit. And years later, something like that, the Global South emerged, and also Bishop Robinson emerged. He came to Hong Kong also. At that time, it is a pressing issue for the Anglican Communion. Would you please just briefly describe how about this issue right now? Or if not, it is a long-standing issue, not too much to emphasize on the officers, or what would be the present challenge to the Anglican Communion?
Depends who you ask. It is a pressing issue in parts of the Anglican Communion.
Some part.
In some parts. In North America, with certain other groups, parts of Australia, certain other groups. It's a very pressing issue. And it's a very pressing issue for the unity of the communion. Or to be absolutely specific, because we will not agree on that point, it is a very pressing issue for how we disagree well, and whether we're capable of disagreeing well. To be honest, in very large parts of the communion, it's not an issue that registers very high. In the South Pacific, the rising water levels are a much more pressing issue. They're an issue of life or death. In much of Africa, the expansion of the deserts is an issue of life or death. Or if you're in the DRC or South Sudan, the issue of warfare and mass rape, the terrible abuse of women in warfare, is the pressing issue. The issue of surviving from today till tomorrow is the pressing issue. And in other parts of the communion, the issue of whether you'll be denounced to your neighbours for being a Christian is a pressing issue. So it varies very, very extensively.
So this is a hard job for you as
For me,
finance.
it's one of a very significant number of issues on the agenda. And at times it's the most important, and at times other issues shove it aside and there's something else that is very, very important, and it varies. We had a meeting 2 weeks ago which was very little reported, even by the church press, that of a meeting at the, I didn't see whether Episcopal News Service picked it up, of a meeting at the Vatican of political and religious leaders from the South Sudan. It was an extraordinary meeting. The Pope at the end knelt before the leaders of the South Sudan, the political leaders, kissed their shoes and begged them to make peace. I mean, that is an extraordinary, I can't describe the significance, the astonishment of that moment. It was the first time, as far as I know, since the Reformation, that the Reformed Church, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics had worked absolutely together on an issue of peace building in that way. It's extraordinary, absolutely unique. Whether it succeeds is a different question. I don't want to overclaim for it, but it certainly had a huge impact on them. At that, I can assure you, at that meeting, I don't think anyone at any point raised the issue of same-sex relations.
If I may add, for the benefit of my brother, this problem is not just within the Anglican community.
Oh, well, that's true.
So there is no church that is not wrestling with it. So Anglicans just cool it, because it is not just within the Anglican community.
It's not. I'm also cautious about describing this as a problem, to be fair. You know, it's not an issue, it's not a problem, it's about people. And when we're dealing with people, we treat them as people made in the image of God and with the dignity of being in the image of God. And how we deal with people of different views, from views that are passionately, deeply against any same-sex relations, through to people who believe it's a matter of justice, not a matter of right, but just a matter of justice. And it is injustice not to accept same-sex marriage. You know, right through that range of opinions, whether you're dealing with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, intersex, queer, or other gender options and preferences, whichever you're dealing with, the first rule is these are people. And I think the most painful part for me of the decisions that have to be made is I know at every moment that I write a letter or make a decision that I'm making a decision about people, and that there is no decision that will result in nobody getting hurt. If I decided differently on the decision about same-sex spouses, and it hurt a lot of people, but I would have hurt a huge number of people elsewhere in the community. And there wasn't a nice solution, which I looked at and thought, nah, I don't want to do that. I'll take the nasty solution. It's not as simple as that.
I'd say I think it's also an issue where certainly in a lot of parts of the communion, it's not just an issue, in inverted commas, for the churches. It is a matter which is still unresolved in wider society.
Oh, absolutely.
And so how we model the behaviour of remembering and always respecting the people, the individuals, actually is important for how the rest of society begins to understand and to also model that kind of respectful behaviour to individuals. remembering that they are people first and their sexuality is not what defines them.
I think also it's a point I should have made in answer to Mary's question. Forgive me, Mary, I omitted to make it. Was on Wednesday afternoon, not as part of, we're sort of suspending ourselves for a moment, and there will be a voluntary session on what's called Living in Love and Faith, which Paul is deeply familiar with, which is a huge programme being run in the Church of England, including people involved in the study and in the work from a huge range of views, including people who are openly in same-sex partnerships, through to people who feel very strongly that that is the wrong thing to do. And it is a consultation with the ACC, which Dr. Ava John will be presenting. And it will, I hope, lead to significantly more careful listening to each other around the world. And I think that's a very major step. We're doing it out of the convenience of people being gathered and not as a formal part of the agenda, because it doesn't fall within what the ACC can do.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, I gave you a misleading answer.
Thank you.
Hong Kong Shin Kong Hui Echo Newsletter, Yit Sang Lang. What kind of role do you expect Hong Kong to play with regards to China?
This is known in English as a hospital pass.
Well, Hong Kong is part of China, so I think.
Why don't you answer in Cantonese? Cut most of us out of it.
Right.
No, not at all. Carry on.
Right, and so what the role of Hong Kong is to definitely is to help build up China, because Hong Kong is part of it.
Yes. And how are you planning to build up the churches or become a bridge between the communion and the Chinese churches?
I can answer.
Oh, you can answer. Oh, yes, you're better. Yes.
Thank you. I came on my way here, or rather, while I was in the region. We went early. I went early with a group from Lambeth Palace, representing the Anglican Communion, and visited Beijing and Shanghai. And in Beijing, visited the new department that is overseeing religious affairs in China, in the PRC. And subsequently down to Shanghai and met the equivalent people in Shanghai, and also the newly elected leadership of the TSPM, the Three Cells Patriotic Movement, and the CCC. And one of the people who was with us was Peter Kuhn, the Reverend Peter Kuhn, the Provincial Secretary of the province of Hong Kong. And of course, Archbishop Paul Kong is constantly linking with Beijing. And it is a very important bridge. Bridge is a good word, and a very important bridge, and one we value very gratefully. And Peter Kuhn was extremely helpful to us. And the meetings were very, very helpful. And I think it's been helpful as well that the chairman of the ACC, which is in a very senior position in the communion, is from China. Hong Kong Chinese.
Well, in the joint declaration signed between the British and the Chinese government in 1984 over the future of Hong Kong, one of the things it was stated in the joint declaration is that the Church of China and the Church of Hong Kong will exist independently. We are, in a sense, we are not allowed to evangelize each other. We can't go into China and evangelize, and vice versa. But having said that, over the years, in Hong Kong has been returned to China over 21 years now, through all these visits and exchange visits and programs, we become very good friends and very close partners in mission. And we learn from each other, we encourage each other, we strengthen each other in mission. So we are very close, very close. So as His Grace has been saying, and Hong Kong can play a role as a bridge to link the Church of China with the outside world, in particular with the community.
It's a remarkable church.
One more from me, if I may. You mentioned a litany of issues that people around the world are facing. One of them, of course, is security. We're meeting in Asia a week from the bombings in Sri Lanka, where yesterday the bishops of the Church of Ceylon had to advise their clergy to consider whether it's safe to hold worship services tomorrow. Meeting in the region, is there anything that should be said or could be said about the situation?
We will be referring to those atrocities against Christians and others very clearly over the next few days. I think one of the strengths of the communion remains very, very clearly the support of those caught up in such horrendous events. The greatest characteristic of conflict is feeling absolutely isolated. You feel there's nobody else there. I mean, it never fails to surprise me that the smallest things can make a difference. I mean, phone calls, just being in touch, let alone praying for people, and tomorrow in church observing silence and prayer for them, says to them that you're not on your own. We do remember you. You're not forgotten. And I always think, well, what difference will that make? And then I'm astonished when I go there and they say, oh, it made such a difference, And I those of us who've not lived through such things just really find it hard to understand that. So one of the areas that we do focus on in the ACC and will in the Lambeth Conference is the area of the persecuted church. And it's a major feature of discussion of primates meetings as well. So all 4 instruments of communion focus on that with grief, but also seeking to find ways of addressing it. As you know, there's a Bishop of the Church of England at the request of the Foreign Secretary. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has asked the Bishop of Truro, Philip Mann-Stephen, who was head of CMS, has very major worldwide experience, to chair a commission on looking at the question of persecution of Christians. And it's just issued a preliminary report just last week, just before Easter or after it. Pretty hard-hitting stuff, not least saying religious illiteracy is a major problem, a sense of slight embarrassment about faith is a major problem, and that the needs, being quite specific about what needs to change to support persecuted Christians more around the world. And what we've just seen in Sri Lanka was an attack. To be fair, in Sri Lanka, it was an attack on the whole of Sri Lanka. There is no sense in which the government colludes with, or of Sri Lanka colludes with that. It was an attack on the whole country, an attempt to destabilise the country. In other places, there's been significant persecution without quite so much government action, usually at a lower level.
Thank you very much for sharing your trip to Shanghai just now. Yeah, as China is emerging, some of the Western countries, allow me to say that, and also international human rights organizations, they put very much concern about the religious freedom in mainland China. Yeah, at the same time, as some churches, we understand that we want to do as much as possible with that limited space. With amongst these two approaches, one emphasizes much on the religious freedom for the structure in politics, and one emphasizes much more on the just expanding the space as much as possible to do the evangelization. Yeah. What is your opinion towards just the religious freedom situation in mainland China and the evangelization? Yeah, the job too.
It's a very complicated situation, and I do not have the experience to comment in an informed way. And I welcome and was conscious. We met with the Conference of Catholic Bishops, the head of the Conference of Catholic Bishops in Beijing, and we had a very interesting meeting with a number of bishops. And there was certainly great pleasure in the fact that the Vatican has now signed, or last September signed an agreement with the Vatican, and that the position there is regularized. And I think that was a major step forward. We had some private meetings, and what goes on in private meetings is kept private. I think the church is, the Anglican Communion is quite clear, and the UN is quite clear, and international law is quite clear on the importance of freedom of religion and belief, which, as I understand it, is guaranteed in the Chinese constitution. And freedom of religion and belief is something that has to be watched out for and protected constantly in every country. It is very rare that it is purposeful and useful to make great public statements about these things. It's sometimes better to talk
So you prefer
privately, which is what the Vatican does. I learned my lessons from Rome.
No, but I think that other than Roman Catholic, after the Anglican, there's religious community is much more bigger than that.
Oh yeah, the Protestant Church in China, of course, is
right,
a combination.
Disagreement with the decision of the Vatican. Just now in Hong Kong, the two retired cardinals, they have two different opinions on this.
Do they?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with this.
No, it's not mine. I want to raise up is that maybe you're right as a Roman Catholic, as the Anglican Communion, we want to keep the things, maybe the official, keeping privately. But there are also some other opinions that.
There are a range of opinions. What I do when I look at the church in China, I am astonished at the growth of the church, the Protestant church in China. I can't speak for the Catholic Church, but in 1949, 50, late 40s, there were a few 100,000, perhaps 1 million Protestant Christians. Today, 35 million. I think as the Anglican Communion, we have quite a lot to learn from the church in China. And I would like to learn a lot from them. And in fact, we have invited them to the Lambeth Conference in order that we may learn from them.
I think we've time for maybe just one more, if one more person has a question.
Can I ask an environmental question? Because there's quite a heavy carbon footprint of this sort of gathering and the Lambeth Conference next year. Can I ask you how you justify that, please?
Yes. First of all, we make a payment of carbon offset as part of the cost of the conference. That's a very clear policy. And secondly, it's a similar question, the one that everyone always asks, the Worldwide Conference on Climate Change, when they meet in huge numbers around the world. We have adopted a policy over the last few years of increasing use of electronic meetings. So using screens and telephone meetings, and that has cut back the amount of travel. Sometimes it is necessary to meet, to see each other face to face, because you can just do and say things that you can't do in any other way. And sometimes, even with the carbon footprint, for those who are suffering particularly from climate change, the experience of being with others who are there physically with them, who put an arm around them literally rather than metaphorically, who express their concern and sorrow and go away more determined to campaign, more than offsets the use of the carbon. So it's a balance to be held. And it's one that I think I'm very conscious of. I think that the Communion is very, very conscious of, and if we ever don't forget it, the people from the South Pacific and Archbishop Tarbo from Southern Africa remind us very, very forcefully indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Graces, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Thank you.